In this video, we're going to be talking about the divine command theory and a famous problem that comes from Plato, known as the Euthyphro dilemma. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about what the Euthyphro dilemma is and distinguish two horns of the dilemma. We'll then talk about the divine command theory and which particular horn that this theory is attempting to take. And we'll talk about why that might be an attractive option for a theist to try to take when thinking about the Euthyphro dilemma. But then we will turn to the Euthyphro-style argument against the divine command theory to show why maybe a theist doesn't want to take that horn of the Euthyphro dilemma. And this will also lead into talking about the divine perfection argument from our book, and then we will just return back to the Euthyphro dilemma to sort of summarize the results that we've seen. So, in Plato's Euthyphro dialogue, there's a conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro. And in this conversation, Socrates raises a dilemma that has posed a serious challenge to those who hope to ground ethics in a divine source such as God. And so, to this day, many philosophers, both theist and atheist, still take this dilemma to be an incredibly serious challenge to trying to use religion as a source of morality. In the dialogue, Euthyphro makes a suggestion that attempts to make a connection between piety, a moral idea, and religion. He says, piety is what is loved by the gods, and impiety is what is hated by the gods. So what this statement says is that there's certain actions that are pious, and there's certain actions that are impious. There's also certain actions that the gods love, and there's also certain actions that the gods hate. And he says there's a sort of correlation between the two. All those actions that are pious are also the actions that are loved by gods. But Socrates notices that there are still two ways of reading that claim. There's two ways of understanding that correlation that Euthyphro is suggesting. And so Socrates asks Euthyphro to clarify, do the gods love these actions because they're pious? Or are the actions pious because the gods love them? So we can modify this conversation to apply it to our more modern context and our current sort of topic by, instead of talking about piety, talk about moral rightness and moral wrongness. And instead of talking about Greek gods and what they love or sort of don't love or what they hate, we can talk about the theistic conception of God and what God might command or forbid. So consider the following claim that a theist might make. Morality is what is commanded by God, and immorality is what is forbidden by God. This statement, just like Euthyphro's, is ambiguous, and there's two ways of interpreting it. And so the theist has to make a choice according to, does God command these actions because they're right, or are these actions right because God commands them? So this is the sort of dilemma. There's two options, and the theist, if they say that morality is what is commanded by God, they have to either say, one, that God commands them because they're right, or they have to say the alternative, that these actions are right because God commands them. We could also put this in terms of prohibitions instead of commands. So we could say, does God forbid actions because they are wrong? Or are actions wrong because God forbids them? We can make this more concrete by considering a specific example. So let's consider two competing claims that a theist might make about torture and God's commands. A theist could say that God forbids torture because it's wrong, or they could say that torture is wrong because God forbids it. Now, both of these sort of claims say that there's a sort of a perfect correlation between what is wrong and what God forbids, but they give different sort of explanations of this correlation. So 1 and 2, even though they both agree that there's a perfect correlation, they say very different things, and in fact, they are incompatible with one another. They cannot both be true. If number 1 is true, then number 2 is false. And if number 2 is true, then number 1 is false. So it is impossible for a theist to believe both of these claims. They need to pick one or the other, because both of these yes, they agree that there's a perfect correlation between what God forbids and what's morally wrong, but they disagree about the explanation for why there is this perfect correlation. So, what exactly is the difference then between number 1 and 2? So, a lot of students look at those two claims about torture and God's sort of prohibitions, and they think, I don't get it. I don't see a difference. It looks like they're saying exactly the same thing. So, what is the difference between saying that God forbids torture because it's wrong and saying that torture is wrong because God forbids it? It has to do with the word because. This word has a kind of direction or order. When we say that A because B, we're saying that B explains A. The explanation goes from B to A. B is why A takes place, but the direction doesn't go the other way. For example, it makes sense to say that George died because of a gunshot wound to the head. So the gunshot wound to the head is why George died. It explains how he died. But it wouldn't make very much sense to say that George had a gunshot wound to the head because he died. That seems really strange. It's not that his dying doesn't explain why he has the gunshot wound to his head. It's not like the dying caused the gunshot. No, the explanation has to go the other way. The gunshot wound, or the gunshot, is what explains why he's dead, not vice versa. So the first claim makes sense, the second one does not. And so because has this order, has this direction that's very important. And so when we look at sort of the first claim, it says that morality explains why God forbids torture. But on number 2, the idea is that God's forbidding torture explains why sort of torture is wrong, why it's immoral. So statement 1 implies that the wrongness of torture explains why God gives the prohibition. And that means that the wrongness of torture would have to metaphorically come before God's forbidding it. And that makes wrongness of torture independent of God's commands. So if morality is explaining why God gives the commands that God does, then morality has to sort of be there independent of those commands. Now, statement number 2, though, implies that God forbidding torture is what explains why torture is wrong. So God's sort of prohibition is explaining the immorality. The explanation is going in the opposite direction. So on this view, God's commands metaphorically come before morality. Before God issues the command, nothing is right or wrong. On this view, there's nothing that's intrinsically right or wrong about any action, since the rightness or wrongness is determined by this sort of external factor. So there's nothing about the action itself that makes it right or wrong. It's this external feature of God sort of commanding it or prohibiting it that explains, that gives it its morality. So statement 1, you can think of it as morality comes first, and that leads to God's commands. Statement number 2, it looks like you have God's commands first, and that leads to, sort of creates morality. So the dilemma, the Euthyphro dilemma, is that the theist can accept one of these ideas, but they cannot accept both, since they are inconsistent with one another. If morality comes before God's commands, then God's commands cannot come before morality. If God's commands come before morality, then morality cannot come before God's commands. So the theist seems forced to choose between these two options. Now notice I have before here in quotations. That's because I'm not using this in terms of like time. It's not like first morality exists and then God exists. That's not a view that a theist would accept, since they think that God is eternal, and oftentimes you'd think that morality is eternal as well. So the before here is what comes first in explanation. And so it's sort of an analogy here. So the reason this is thought to be a dilemma for the theist is that since they have to pick between one of the two options, the problem is that either option leads to apparent problems for the theist. All right, so let's try to sort of get to the sort of heart of what the problems might be with these two options. We have God commands or forbids actions because they are right or wrong versus actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them. Which of those options do you think best fits with a theist's other beliefs? Which one do you think would be most attractive to a person who believes traditional theism? Now note, it's true that a theist believes in God, but merely believing that God exists does not give you any reason to prefer number one or number two. Because number one says that God gives commands, and because these are sort of right or wrong. So it says that there is a God and God's giving commands. Number two also says that there's a God. And so they both agree that God exists. They just disagree about other things. And so if there's a reason that someone who believes in God should prefer either number one or number two, it will be due to some other beliefs that the theist has. All right, so now we can go back to the divine command theory. This is the theory that an act is morally required just because it is commanded by God and immoral just because God forbids it. So, which horn of Euthyphro's dilemma is the divine command theory adopting? They're taking the second horn. According to the divine command theory, God does not forbid torture because it's wrong. According to the divine command theory, torture is wrong if and when it is, just because God forbids it. So nothing's right or wrong in and of itself. It's God's commanding it that makes it right, and it's God's forbidding it that makes it wrong. And so when most people see the Euthyphro dilemma for the first time, they often think that this is the natural, best, and sort of straightforward option for the theist to take. This idea that things are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them. And the reason that this oftentimes seems like the first natural inclination of theists is because the divine command theory does seem to mesh well with some common beliefs that occur within traditional versions of theism. So there's this idea that God is the creator of everything that exists. We might say, well, if a theist denies the divine command theory, if they say that God commands actions because they are right, then it seems as if morality exists independently of God. And that would seem to mean that God did not create morality and is thereby not the creator of everything that exists. All right, so there's one theistic idea that might give reason to prefer the divine command theory, if one is a theist. Traditional theism also believes that God is omnipotent, is all-powerful. Well, if a theist denies the divine command theory, then it seems as if morality exists independently of God, as we've said. And wouldn't that mean that God doesn't have power over morality? Wouldn't that mean that God is sort of limited by sort of the moral law? Wouldn't that mean that God doesn't have the power to make some actions right or wrong? And so wouldn't you thereby be, if you deny the divine command theory, wouldn't that thereby contradict the theist belief that God is all-powerful? All right. There's also this idea of God as sovereign, sort of having sort of rule over everything. Well, if a theist denies the divine command theory, wouldn't that mean that morality limits or constrains that what God can or cannot do? It looks as if God is not sort of entirely free, is not ruling over everything. It looks like morality is sort of ruling over God. And wouldn't that mean that God doesn't have authority, doesn't rule over morality, and isn't completely sovereign in that way? Nonetheless, despite those initial sort of ideas for why a theist might be attracted to the divine command theory, the divine command theory has its own problems even for theism. So these can be seen when we consider a variant of the Euthyphro dilemma applied to God's commands. Consider the following question. Does God have any reasons for giving the commands that he or she does? So this is a yes or no question. Either God has reasons or God does not. Notice that doesn't mean if God has reasons for giving God's commands, that doesn't mean we know what God's reasons are. This question doesn't ask, do we know why God commands the things that God does? The question is, does God have any reasons, whether we know them or not? Either answer here seems to get the divine command theory in trouble. So let's see how we can turn that into a few different arguments against the divine command theory. So we can turn this into a Euthyphro argument. The first premise is the dilemma. Either God has reasons for issuing his or her commands, or God doesn't have any reasons for issuing these commands. Notice this premise doesn't say we know what God's reasons are. It just says either there are reasons or there aren't. Well, if God has no reasons for issuing the commands that he or she does, then it looks like God's decisions and morality itself would be entirely arbitrary. And so if God's decisions and commands are arbitrary, then God would be acting capriciously and sort of imperfectly. And it looks like morality would likely be imperfect as well. And so let's put a little sort of meat on this sort of bones. The idea is, if God has no reason for giving one command rather than another, then God could just as easily command us to torture and kill innocent babies as God could forbid us from doing so. If there's no reason for giving one command rather than the other, then God could just as easily tell us to torture and kill innocent babies. But that would mean that God's commands are just sort of random, arbitrary, and that would seem to render God's behavior sort of imperfect. Perfect creatures do not act sort of arbitrarily. Now, you might sort of say, well, look, but God would never command those kinds of things. God would never command us to do something so terrible as killing and torturing an innocent baby. But then it looks like you're saying that, well, there's certain reasons that God would not command these things. But if God has reasons for issuing the commands that he or she does, so maybe you say, well, God wouldn't command us to torture because torture causes severe pain. It humiliates that person. It fails to respect their autonomy. Well, then if those reasons are why God sort of prohibits us from torturing, commands us not to torture, then it looks like those reasons and not God's commands are what make the actions right or wrong. And so either God is capricious and imperfect and sort of acting arbitrarily, or we have to say that the divine command theory is false. And the idea is God is, according to the theist, according to their own views, not capricious and not imperfect. Thus, according to the theist's own views, it looks like they ought to believe that the divine command theory is false. The book also introduces the divine perfection argument. This says that if the divine command theory is true, then a morally perfect God could have created a flawless morality that required us to rape, steal, and kill, and forbade use of any acts of kindness or generosity. And the idea is because, according to the divine command theory, no actions are right or wrong in and of themselves. They only become right or wrong due to the action of God commanding them or forbidding them. And so if God commanded us to rape, steal, and kill, then that would be the morally right thing to do, and God would still be morally perfect because God didn't command us to do anything wrong. Because by commanding it, God thereby made those things right. But that is, a morally perfect God could not have issued such commands. Anyone who did so would be morally imperfect. Thus, the divine command theory has to be false. The idea here is that it looks as if the divine command theory can't actually make sense of what it means to say that God is morally perfect, that God is omnibenevolent. Because on omnibenevolence, in order for that to have substance, it looks like there has to be some standard of moral perfection that God lives up to. But if God creates that standard could be anything. And now when you say that God is all good or morally perfect, you're just saying that God does what God does. And that might mean rape, steals, and kills. It is, if something could be omnibenevolent and morally perfect and command us to rape, steal, and kill, that doesn't seem to be a very substantive notion of moral perfection. It doesn't seem to really have any content that's worthy of worship. Whereas if you make moral perfection a standard that God lives up to, as opposed to just some arbitrary thing created by God's commands. That would thereby seem to say, well, God could have done something immoral, but God chose to live up to the standard of morality. That looks like you're actually making God worthy of sort of praise. So let's try to summarize this dilemma for the theist. On one side, the theist can say that God commands or forbids actions because those actions are right or wrong. And on the other side, the theist could say actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids those actions. Let's consider the pros and cons of each view for the theist to sort of see how this dilemma arises. On the first side, the advantages are it seems to make God and morality non-arbitrary. On this view, God has reasons for giving the commands that God does. God's not just acting sort of capriciously and arbitrarily. God sort of will not command that we torture and kill innocent babies, since God has very strong moral reasons for not telling us to do that. It also preserves a substantive notion of God's moral perfection. So it makes sense of sort of God's omnibenevolence. God is omnibenevolent because there's this standard of goodness, and God sort of freely chooses to live up to that standard of goodness. And thus it makes God's notion of omnibenevolence sort of substantive and would thereby make God something worthy of praise. The problems for this view, however, for the theist, are that it would seem to undermine God's omnipotence. Doesn't this mean that God doesn't have power over morality? Isn't God's power being constrained by morality? And it would also seem to undermine God's sovereignty. It looks as if morality is sort of ruling over God and limiting God in that way. God does not rule over morality, since God does not have the power to change or decide what is moral or immoral. Well, what about the other side, the divine command theory side that says actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids those actions? Well, the advantage here is that it seems to preserve God's omnipotence because God is not being limited by anything outside of God. There is no morality sort of outside of God's commands, and so God is sort of has the power to command anything there. God is not limited by morality, and God has the power to create morality. It also preserves God's sovereignty, since God sort of rules over morality. God decides what is moral or immoral. The problems for this view, for the divine command theory, however, brought out by that sort of the reasoning we've seen earlier, is that the divine command theory makes God and morality arbitrary. God has no reasons for giving the commands that God does. And there's no reason why these sort of things are right or wrong, because God could have commanded us to do anything else. Morality could have consisted of sort of torturing and killing innocent babies if God had decided so, and God had no reason not to decide so. And it is, if that's the case, it would seem to undermine the authority and the objectivity of morality. It would also seem to undermine God's moral perfection or omnibenevolence, or at the very least, the claim that God is omnibenevolent, is all good and morally perfect on the divine command theory, seems to be entirely trivial. You might sort of say, well, what do you mean that God is all good? Well, God's commands are perfectly good. Well, if God's commands are what make things good or bad, right or wrong, when you say that God's commands are good, you're just saying God commands what God's command. And that's trivially true. No matter what God commands, it'd still be true that God commands what God commands, even if God commanded us to torture and kill innocent babies. And so if the divine command theory is right, God would still be morally perfect, since when God commands us to torture and kill innocent babies, that makes that the right thing to do, a good thing to do. And thus, when God commands it, God is commanding something that is good. and so the idea here is, look, it just makes this idea, this claim that God is omnibenevolent, it doesn't really mean anything. So many theistic philosophers look at those problems for the divine command theory, and they actually end up rejecting it in favor of a view that says that God commands things because they are moral. Now, if a theist takes that view, they need to explain how such a view is consistent with his or her other beliefs. So they need to try to deal with those cons. So how could a theist who takes that position try to make sense of God's omnipotence or sovereignty? Well, they might try to argue that God is not limited by morality on their view, since God still has the power to give immoral commands. So God has the ability to say, torture, kill innocent babies. However, given that God has a morally perfect nature, that nature means that God, even though God has the power, God chooses not to exercise that power. God has the power to command us to torture, but God goes, you know what? Look at torture. That's a terrible thing. And so I'm going to tell people not to torture. But someone might say, well, isn't it still true that you have to say that God doesn't have the power to make torture morally right if you reject the divine command theory? Well, this gets into some really tricky theological issues about the nature of omnipotence. Most theists in history have accepted a view that omnipotence isn't actually the power to do absolutely anything we can describe, but usually they say it's the ability to do anything that makes logical sense. And that might give some wiggle room because they might say, look, it's a contradiction to say that torturing innocent babies just for the heck of it is morally right. And so someone might say, when we say that God cannot do that, we're not limiting God's power because that's just something that doesn't make any sense. It's not really a possibility. And so there's no everything that's actually possible, God is able to do. But this idea of making torture innocent of babies morally right, it's like asking, can you make 2 + 2 = 272? It doesn't make any sense. All right, but whether that reply works is rather tricky. It's something for you to think about. So that's it for today. See you next time when we talk about, well, if one doesn't appeal to God as a source of morality, or what are the other potential connections someone might try to make between religion and ethics? See you then. Bye-bye.